there's been none notified to me. So we move to item 9 on the agenda, which is the Council-controlled organisations review approval of the terms of reference. If I can ask Claire Gomez and Alistair Cameron to come to the table, please. The motion relates to agreeing to the terms of reference for the review, noting the timing and phasing, and agreeing the selection criteria for the independent review panel members. I'll move that. Have I got a seconder, please? Councillor Philippina. And Claire, I think we'll ask you to lead off on the paper.
Tēnā koutou, Councillor. As His Worship has just indicated, this report seeks approval for the draft terms of reference for an independently led review of Auckland Council's 5 substantive CCOs, and it also seeks approval and agreement of the criteria for the selection of the independent review panel members. So the draft terms of reference sets out the objectives, the scope and the approach for the proposed review. The review has 2 objectives. That's to ensure that we have an effective and efficient model of service delivery for Auckland Council and Aucklanders, and to ensure that we have a sufficient level of political oversight, public transparency and accountability of the CCOs in their decision making. In developing the draft terms of reference, we did seek input from the councillors at a workshop, and that led to the review focusing on 3 key areas. That's the effectiveness of the CCO model and its roles and responsibilities. Secondly, the accountability mechanisms between the CCOs and the council. And thirdly, the culture of the CCOs and their responsiveness to Aucklanders. Comments were also sought from councillors on the draft terms of reference, and we circulated that to the governing body members and IMSB, and also to the CCOs for their comment. The CCOs have indicated their willingness to be involved and to participate and support the review. The IMSB board has identified a number of issues which we will pass on to the panel members, and they also asked for a couple of inclusions into the draft terms of reference which we have included. Feedback that we have received on the draft terms of reference has highlighted the importance of the community input into the review, and there is a mechanism proposed for that. It's also highlighted that it's important that we understand and look at the role of the directors and the processes around them, and that is included. The issues around brand attribution and whether we are clearly acknowledging Auckland Council's role in supporting the CCOs and funding them has been raised, and we've included that. And I think finally the very real challenge of the timeframe has also been raised by a number of councillors. A number of issues have been raised with regard to CCO performance, individual CCOs' performance or matters. We will provide that information to the panel once selected. The second part of the report refers to the panel appointment process and identifies criteria that we would use to help guide the appointment of those members. And again, that has been circulated for your input, and feedback has been included into those. I think that's the main issues that the report deals with, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Is there anything that you'd like to add to that, Alistair? If not, I think we'll move straight into questions. As you're aware, we have had informal discussions and workshop around the terms of reference, and there has been quite extensive consultation on it. So I think we have captured most of the things that councillors have raised. I've had an approach from a councillor, Councillor Darby, to include a D on the screen, and I'm happy as chair to accept that as an addition to the terms of reference. That's, I think, consistent with what we're trying to do here. But let's deal with questions first, and then we will deal with comments separately. So, questions from Councillor Coombe.
Thank you for the work on this and bringing it together, and it's obviously got a lot of support from councillors. I am interested to know more the feedback, specific feedback that you received from the CCOs, because it does say that in the report. But I do have a specific question that's come via Chair Kath Hanley. So she hasn't come along today, but she did ask that if I could put this out there for discussion. Because the concern that she raised is in terms of the terms of reference, it provides for input from the local boards at the early stage, But when it comes to the draft, there's no mention that the local boards will be informed about the draft or the IMSB. And I think in terms of like the processes that we have developed, aligned with the Joint Governance Working Party, has been that local boards will have an opportunity to see a draft at the same time, so there's no surprises. So my question really is, how will that work in terms of the process so that we can ensure that there is that early input, but that the local boards aren't surprised by what comes out of the draft? And if the process does allow for that ability, whether it's through the Chairs Forum or some mechanism, that we can ensure that everybody on Auckland Council feels part of the process.
Thank you. In terms of the process, we are taking this to the Chairs Forum on the 9th of December for discussion and for a conversation around their involvement. There are actually an issue in terms of the local board's role in representing the communities and being the voice in how they want to, or how we can handle that process with the independent panel, which we also need to consider. In terms of the draft report, this will be an independent panel. We can provide them with a draft copy of the report, but in terms of actually considering the recommendations, that will all happen once the final report is included for both the governing body and for the local boards. And any decisions and anything that's worked through will happen, after the review is completed. So there will be an opportunity for their input and involvement at that point. It is not it won't be the governing body's or the local board's role to direct the independent panel once a draft report is received.
Thank you very much. Councillor Newman.
Good morning. With respect to accountability, the proposed terms of reference, it looks very weighted towards holding, a review in relation to how the CCOs are accountable. I'm just wondering the extent to which the terms of reference provide scope for reviewing the council's success and the appropriateness of the mechanisms that we use to hold the CCOs to account. Do you have any comments on that to start?
Through the Chair, that is, I believe, the point of resolution, the proposed resolution by Councillor Darby up there for number D, which is to kind of address that point, because we did feel it was perhaps not as clear as we had expected in the draft terms of reference.
And I agree with D for that purpose, for that reason. So how in effect will that be achieved? Because do you have any comments on that? Because I did want to delve into this.
Through the Chair, I think how all of this will be achieved will be up to the independent panel and the processes that they propose to undertake.
I think sorry, Councillor Newman.
See, for example, we're getting ourselves into it. Actually, no, I'll leave it for comments rather.
Yeah, I think the important thing about why we are setting up an independent review rather than an in-house review is to ensure that the people with the competencies to make this judgment will make a judgment both of the CCO's performance, but also our performance of our accountability requirements and obligations, and whether the mechanisms can work. So it's important to say for the review to indicate whether council could be utilising existing mechanisms more effectively, or whether we need further mechanisms. And of course, they will review the mechanisms that we have recently put in place with the Oversight Committee and the system of liaison councillors. Both of those will have been working for about 5 months by the time the independent review gives the report. But it is to review everything from both ends of it. So it's not simply a case of saying the CCOs haven't been doing this. It may be a case of saying, well, the council had these mechanisms but did not adequately utilise them, and these are our recommendations. But they will be independent of us. Councillor Walker.
I've got about 3 or 4 questions, and I think Alistair and Claire probably are familiar with some of them. So the first question is around the information that we're going to be providing that will be informing the review, and I'm thinking particularly about information that the public are going to have. And I think the context around that is I would suggest that the public are very poorly informed about the CCOs, about the council, about the relationship with the CCOs, about what the CCOs do. So are we going to be putting some information out there? So, for example, if I look at RFA...
Sorry, Councillor, can I just apologise for interrupting. Can you just come to the question so that the officers have a clear idea of what you're asking?
The question is around what information we're going to be putting out there that will be informing the public so they are better able to engage.
Thank you. We'll just take the questions one at a time.
I think the first point to note is that the terms of reference contained an expectation that there will be public engagement so that the independent panel will get the views of the public. We've started discussions with our internal engagement team to see how we could support the independent panel in that regard, and those conversations have basically suggested, like in a 10-year budget or an annual plan consultation, that there's got to be sufficient information provided to the public to allow for a meaningful response to come back. Now, what information that will be hasn't been determined yet. We're still working that up. So I guess all I can tell you at this stage is that the intention is to provide sufficient information with whatever consultation mechanism is developed to support the independent panel.
Thank you. Question 2.
The other question just goes to timing. If we have issues that are brought up by submitters that really require immediate attention, they could be over legal matters, they could be over a variety of matters, what provision is there to deal with such instances?
I think my response to that through the chair would be that if they're matters that require actual legal action, they're probably not matters that should be dealt with by the review, but probably subject to separate proceedings. Yes. Through this process, we may discover performance-related matters that you, as a governing body, may want to deal with directly with the CCOs, or that there may be separate legal proceedings that need to take place. The fact that those examples exist, I think, would be information that the panel would take into account, but I don't think it's for the independent panel to resolve those issues.
Okay.
Thank you. Third question. We'll make this the last one if I can, Councillor, before we go to other councillors.
This question just goes to some of these serious matters. So there may be matters that members of the public wish to raise with an element of confidentiality. Is there going to be some provision, some kind of whistleblower provision within what is proposed so that people can be free and frank?
I may throw this to my colleague, but I think we did have a discussion about this as a team the other day, because I think there may be some members of the public who would want that ability. There's some practicalities that will need to be considered, such as once council has hold of such information and it's subject to the Lagoima provisions, are they adequate to keep that information safe? But I think as a matter of principle, it would probably be sensible to have some form of public engagement where if people wanted to keep their views confidential for whatever matter, then we could look to do that. How we do that in practice is something that we need to work through.
Thank you.
And the last question...
Well, sorry, can I come back to the last question because I want to give everybody a chance to ask. Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. You actually asked the first question. So we are looking at both ends, CCOs and Council, for that review, and the process statements of intent, memorandum of understanding is included. So thank you for answering that one. The second question is the interaction between the review panel, the independent review panel, and the oversight committee as set up this term. The linkages there will there be discussions between the panel and the oversight committee, or you just think the report arrives at the end and then there are discussions at that point?
whatever you collectively want.
I think the idea was that we were going to have progress reports, and the progress reports would come to the Oversight Committee, and I think that would be useful, actually. Even though the committee, the panel has to be seen as independent, but it will want to have interaction with the people most affected by the relationship with the CCOs. So I would imagine, Alistair, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but they would come to the Oversight Committee, and there would be a discussion at that level.
Now that I've been advised, I can confirm that the update reports will come to the Oversight Committee.
Spoken like a good civil servant.
Thank you, Alistair.
Councillor Young.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a very quick question is how many experts you are going to appointing for this panel? Do you have a planning?
The draft terms of reference, I think they provide for up to 4 members. It's going to depend on availability and level of interest.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Darby.
Thank you, Mayor. And thanks, Mayor, for the inclusion of the D. Thanks, staff, for working that out. Just on that, I'm aware of the accountability policy that we have for CCOs and the accountability provisions under the legislation. And then there's the additional accountability provisions under Section 91. Do we, on that, to be honest, on the D, do we fully exercise that Section 91 requiring all the CCOs other than Auckland Transport to have a 10-year plan, a service level plan, an asset renewal plan? As I'm not sure whether you might recollect that detail, and I don't expect you to recollect the legislation, Alistair, but do we exercise that additional accountability provision under Section 91?
Through the Chair, not at present. In effect, the 10-year budget was seen as a mechanism for sort of providing that sort of group planning. So that is a current mechanism that isn't in use. Whether there is value in that is something that the panel can look at.
Will now be flushed out through the review. Thank you. Given 2 questions further.
Yep.
Given the review could lead to a recommendation from the panel for legislative change, what consideration has been given to the importance of getting the buy-in of the current government, Minister of Local Government?
I might be better placed to answer that, Councillor. At the beginning of the process, actually long before the Council has considered it formally, I spoke to the Minister of Local Government and other ministers to say I intend to propose this review, and we need you to be informed at the beginning of the process, because this process may lead to legislative change, and we want you to have an input to it and to be comfortable with it. And then I spoke to the Minister again more recently. She hasn't asked for direct input into it, but she believes that the review is a good idea and would be collaborative in implementing recommendations by the Council, but that of course is subject to the concurrence of her colleagues. But we've kept the central government informed precisely because part of the recommendations of the review committee may be that there is a requirement for legislative change, and it's important that that happened.
So, question following that then, are we going to run these terms of reference past the Minister and get at least sort of some informal confirmation? Is that the intent?
The terms of reference I explained to the Minister in broad terms, not the specific terms set out here, but once this Council has made its decision, I would provide the Minister with a copy of the terms of reference, but it's for us to set the terms of reference. I needed their concurrence with the concept of the review, and that may, and the emphasis is on may, require legislative change. The problem with legislative change, as you and I and everybody else is aware, is that generally takes a period of time. It could be a year, 2 years. So as much as possible, depending on what the independent review comes up with, we'll want to make changes within the existing law, but we leave open the prospect that the law may need to be changed, and we'd seek government concurrence and support for that.
Thank you, appreciate that. Final question, just in terms of the budget to undertake the review, and I thank Councillor Simpson, Chair of Finance, for getting back to me promptly this morning, after I asked the question this morning. The budget is from existing budgets and the governance budget. Now, that necessitates reprioritisation. So I'm not aware of what else exists in that budget and what might need to be reprioritised. If it's not that budget through a reprioritisation, it has to come out of a budget reset. So at the moment, we've got some estimates on what this might cost. But I would be interested in knowing what gives in the governance pool of work streams to allow this work to proceed.
I am conscious while I was answering this, I've got my boss and one of my governance division lead team colleagues sitting at the top table. This may be news to her. I have discussed this with Phil Wilson. As the report says, the budget is currently unbudgeted. We think we should be able to fund a vast chunk of the estimate from programs which there are underspends and other projects where we think we can get most of it from. If we get to a point where we think we can't fund the whole thing, or if we get a bit more clarity around the costs, then we will come back to you at either a sort of half-year budget update or at some stage to have a discussion about where that money comes from. But as of today, we think that we can fund a vast bulk of this from underspends in other areas.
Thank you.
So on that, can we get a memo out as to what that budget looks like? Because I want to know what is underspent and what is planned to be spent and what's going to give if we need to prioritise this.
Do you want to comment at this stage? Okay, I think if we do it by, we'll get a memo out to you rather than ask Marguerite to speculate on it. Can I just come back to the question that I answered? I'm also conscious of the fact that, Claire, you've met with DIA to talk through the terms of reference. Is there anything that you want to report on that discussion?
Just through the chair, we did meet with staff from Department of Internal Affairs. They are very comfortable at the moment. They want to be kept informed of the process. We offered them the opportunity of meeting with the independent panel at a various point if they thought that was appropriate, and we've agreed to keep them informed the whole way through the process.
Thank you very much. On the budgetary matter, I think most councillors around here have indicated to me that they regard this as a priority. And certainly that's what the electorate has indicated. And if that means that other things that are lesser priorities have to go by the board, that's fine. I understand your question is what might go by the board, and we can get a clearer answer on that one. Councillor Watson.
Mayor, so that's reassuring to hear. They won't have to go through the process of having to make a bid through the annual plan like some of the major policy work to do with marina strategies having to go through, so I'm glad to hear that. My question goes to point 27 and engaging with community and stakeholders, and in particular the focus of the panel on CCO boards and senior executives from the CCOs. So I'm just wondering, given the the personnel and time constraints, what the ability is in that process to actually engage with people that work in the CCOs or have worked in some of the CCOs in the past. And I say that because certainly in reviews of educational institutions, it's often the people on the ground or the people with institutional knowledge that have the most valuable contributions to make if you're looking at as to performance and improvement and what's happened on the ground. So, what capacity will there be for people further down the ladder to input within the CCOs, and B, what protection or otherwise might then be provided to allow people to come forward and to make honest and open assessments of information, because clearly they would be in an invidious position if they had anything critical to say.
Through the chair, taking your last point first, I think I said earlier we'll look at a mechanism where those that want to provide information confidentially can. With regard to the capacity for all staff members of the CCOs to engage, the terms of reference don't get down to that level of granularity.
Not all, those who want to.
Those that want to. It will be there will be an aspect of public engagement in it, and similar to a 10-year budget consultation, council and CCO staff are free to participate in that as they wish.
Thank you. Councillor Hills.
Thank you. And obviously, no doubt, we all believe that we can all be doing better, the CCOs can be doing better. But apart from the D and a few other clauses in here, how will the review come back at us or all of us about how we can all improve? I mean, I can think of 3 examples of times we have had massive perceived issues or issues we believe are problems with the CCOs that actually were our decisions, such as the safer speeds, which was unanimous, such as land sales that targets that Panuku tried to bring back to us that we have unanimously supported as part of a budget process, and other things through the letter of expectation that when it starts being implemented we don't like. So how will it actually be black and white on the issue is more around how we respond to what we ask CCO? You know, is it going to be a two-way relationship issue, or is it just going to be about how CCOs can improve?
Through the chair, I think the intent of the review is that it is a two-way relationship and that it looks at both parties, and we'd expect any recommendations that come back to be very clear if there are issues on either side that need to be addressed.
I think through the chair I'd add to that there is a specific bullet point within the terms of reference, or 2. Is council clear about the purpose of each of its CCOs? And the next bullet point, is the purpose still current, and is there adequate direction provided to the CCOs by the council? And I think that covers a lot of the issues that you're sort of raising here. So a focus of the review will be looking at do collectively we as a council provide sufficient direction about what we want the CCOs to achieve, and is there appropriate accountability mechanisms to see whether or not they're achieving that?
I think it is really important to stress that this review looks at both ends of the relationship. We're not simply pointing the finger at one end and saying you're not doing this. We're also looking at whether we are fulfilling our role and whether the mechanisms are in place to ensure that that happens appropriately. Councillor Dalton.
My question was similar, actually, and you might have clarified it in that point, Mr. Mayor. It is about what we've talked about earlier, and we talked a little bit about it yesterday morning. Councillor Darby raised it, was around the policy settings of us. And we can get, D doesn't just quite cover it from my perspective either. We're looking at exercising the current accountability provisions appropriately. We're here, do our directors come into informing the policy, there's 2 pieces here. One is around the policy settings and the instructions that have been given to the CCOs. And the second part is around creating the efficiencies, which I'm assuming the Director of Finance and Strategy will all have input into. So that's part of the process that the directors are informing their knowledge into efficiencies that can be gained along the way and the policy settings of this council.
Yeah, through the chair, the last bullet point before engaging with stakeholders in Auckland on page, I'm not sure what it is on your page, sorry, refers to how well do the CCOs provide advice to the council. That goes some way to addressing the question that you've asked. It could be made more explicit around in terms of policy advice, or similarly we could add that in that wording if the council saw fit.
Yeah. I think the idea is that this review is pretty all-encompassing, and you know, certainly the message that we would give to the appointees on the panel is that we want an absolutely free and frank report and recommendation, looking at all aspects of the of our recommendations, but they also have the ability to go beyond that. And given that it is independent, we're not about to constrain their ability to report freely and frankly, even if we don't like the advice. Right, Councillor Henderson. Last question, I think.
Cool. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just referring to point 28 around our timeframes with a deadline of 30th of July, could I maybe ask you to talk us through that in greater detail, because it seems like such an all-encompassing review is subject to quite a tight timeframe. So maybe talk us in more detail about that.
Sorry. Through the Chair, it is a challenging timeframe for us to complete. That timeframe has been set because if there are any substantial changes that we may want to consider, that needs to go through the long-term plan or 10-year budget process and to provide, so it has to sort of fit within that timeframe. I think the other consideration is that these matters are unsettling for staff, both in the CCO world and, in the market from a commercial perspective. It's important that we sort of undertake it in a timely manner.
Thank you. Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Your Worship. Thank you for the report. I just wanted to ask...
all those things.
Yeah, all of the above. All of the above. I wanted to ask, some of the concern out in the community is that with the CCO model, it's prioritising commercial interests as opposed, versus community interests. Do you think under the CCO accountability and the terms of reference that we're enabling a good enough analysis of that, of the commercial versus community to come through, to be picked up in this kind of, review?
Through the Chair, under the CCO accountability section, there is a bullet point in there that says, are there adequate guidelines for when the CCO should be operating as commercial entities and when they should be prioritising the public good? That is meant to capture that issue.
Okay, so, because it's just looking at whether if there are adequate guidelines, is that going to be enough to pick up this kind of robust discussion that needs to happen about this situation?
My colleague might have something to add to this, but from my perspective, I think those guidelines coupled with, the adequacy of advice when you collectively are making decisions is kind of the key to this. So when you're making decisions to give directions to the CCOs has the impact of, commercial decisions versus the public good being adequately, or the consequences or advice on that being provided to you so you can make an informed decision. I think holistically the intention is for the review to look at those issues, and that should cover off the point that you're raising.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. In asking this question, I won't take up the time later in speaking to it because I sincerely welcome this. I think that the process you have undertaken since the election is one to be truly welcomed, and I give you my full support for it. But my interest and perhaps my question was triggered by that of Councillor Hills. I mean, there's been quite a bit of discussion, and you've given us the confidence that it is going to be a two-way street in terms of those roles and responsibilities that we have as elected members. But on that point, do you see this flowing into the work that is undertaken by Democracy Services in helping alert councillors of when there are decisions that are going to be of great significance, that there might be flow-on impacts, that we are having sufficient information at that time? I'll use an example which falls outside of the period of your tenure as mayor, but we don't want situations where councillors have a case of voters' remorse once a difficult decision is taken, say Ihumātao with the special housing area. We do need almost a trigger to say, this has budgetary implications, this has CCO implications, this is going towards the statements of intent. Do you feel that in the way that we prepare reports and decisions are being taken, that councillors are sufficiently well aware of what the voter implications of those policy decisions might be? Or is that something that you see as an additional stream of work that flows along in parallel path to this?
That's directed my way. I think the important change is the one that we agreed to at the last meeting, which is the role of liaison councillors, because that will give us early warning of issues that the CCOs might raise, looking at it through a particular lens. This is the problem, we're going to deliver this, but without being aware of what the community response or reaction may be. And I think liaison councillors, and we will have the trial of that before we get the results of the review, will enable us to pick up those issues earlier and for the CCOs to be alerted to implications of a decision that they may be considering at a much earlier stage. Now, I just want to be very clear on that. The liaison councillor's role is not one of a deemed director. Apart from for Auckland Transport, we don't have the power to appoint deemed directors, but they are to communicate concerns that we may have so that they can be properly considered by the chair and the board of directors. And I think that will probably, you know, just thinking off the cuff, that will probably be potentially the most effective way of alerting the boards to a potential problem and to us to what the boards might be thinking that have implications that need to be fed back here at an early stage. Now, no system is perfect, but I think that will genuinely help.
I appreciate that, and without taking the time of council now, I mean, we have the opportunity, which I welcomed, at your mayor's meeting yesterday to traverse a number of other issues, so I'm just assuming that those will flow on. Thank you.
Absolutely. They will continue through the term. Right, I have no further questions, so it comes now for, Councillor Walker, you had a last question.
Just follows on from Shane Henderson's question. Is there a possibility of moving the time frame out a little, given that as far as the long-term plan is concerned, we're not determining the consultation items until December? So we have got a bit of scope, haven't we?
Through the chair, if there are changes that are proposed by the review that the council wants to consider and take forward, there might still be a significant amount of work to actually develop up those proposals and what it would look like and what you would need as part of your consultation process. So that time frame there allows for that to happen. If we get the review later and there are recommendations, we might not be able to actually undertake the work that is required that you need to do for a consultation process and to prove the kind of business case of it.
Thank you very much. We'll come now to comment, and if I can just, I just want to pick up on Councillor Walker's comment. I know it's a genuine concern. There are several reasons why we need to move quite quickly on this. The first is so that we can then utilise the consultation processes under the long-term plan next year, which means that we need the report by July. The second thing is, if this is a prolonged report, we'll be more than halfway through a term before we start to act on the changes that we and the public deem to be necessary. So there is some urgency in us making these decisions. Thirdly, if you want to get high quality people for the panel, you may not have the opportunity to have access to as wide a spectrum of people that you could consider if it's going to be prolonged. And also, I think there's the question of cost. I think that we're all ready to pay the cost of this, but if you made it twice as long, then the costs could well be twice as much. And it also induces a degree of uncertainty in the staff in those organisations that Claire has referred to. So I think that's a significant point, Councillor, and deserved a full answer on it. But thank you for making that point. Right, comments now. I've got Councillor Watson.
Thank you.
Councillor Walker, could I please just get you to turn your mic off?
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you for your your initiative in bringing this before us today, and I just wanted to start up by saying a little bit about that general context that is discussed in passing in the agenda item, particularly the notion that that you as the Mayor signalled the need for an independent review of the CCOs and picking up in public opinion, which is quite right. But I think if we were to put it in a more accurate context, those concerns have been around for quite some time. In fact, they've been there since the very start of the Super City, and I think it's important to actually recognise that. I actually wrote to the Minister of Local Government last year asking for a review of the whole Super City structure, not just the CCOs, and there have been other people, other councillors have done that over the years as well. And if we're talking about budgets and whatnot, I thought that was appropriate given that the Super City and the CCO model, which is a big part of the Super City, was imposed upon Auckland. When it was set up, the Auckland ratepayers paid, not too far south, I think, of $200 million for that setup cost, and here we are now paying a substantial sum of money for the review, and I agree with you, Mr. Mayor, that in the absence of anyone putting up their hand to do otherwise, we don't have a choice there, so I commend you for that. But I think that's an important context to take into terms here, that so it is our review, it should be reflecting what our people think, and we should be looking to act on what comes back, because for far too long we have been a rather passive entity in the whole CCO structure as far as I'm concerned. If we take that wider context too, as far as the terms of reference and the ability to comment on the model, I think that's important. For right at the start again, we had people like Professor Ian Shirley, Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Auckland AUT University and Professor of Public Policy, that was going through in 2010 and pointing out in some detail the exact shortcomings of this model, particularly as it went to the CCOs, and over the last 9 years he's been proven to be correct in any number of areas. So I think that general context of concern, if anything, and I think the Mayor picked that up in the election, has only grown. So that's an important thing to concede right at the start. As far as the draft terms of reference go, the reviewers are going to be considering the model, as I said, the CCO accountability, and this rather intangible culture of the CCOs, which we as well, I do anyway as an elected representative, hear quite a lot about. And I tend to hear them from a very identifiable range of CCOs over and over it again. And as our submitters this morning said, some people's contact with these CCOs and their expertise goes back years, as in some detail. So I'm really hopeful that that detailed case history is picked up, because if there's anything that's an insight into the world of the CCO, both good and bad, both sides of the coin here, but in some cases a lot more bad than good with some of them, and vice versa with others. I hope that capacity to pick that up is provided for. As far as the expectations of what the review will deliver, and that's an important point, I think. Already we've had a few naysayers in terms of the review and its focus. People like, I think Matthew Hooton was talking in one of the publications about how at the end of this, he can see nothing but the status quo being maintained and just a few presentational tweaks. I think the expectation is a lot more than that this time round. And again, he and others have talked about the essential failings of the model, in his case, quite humorously talking to the worst of both worlds, Soviet-style centralisation and then non-accountable kind of corporates both chucked in together, so you've got the worst case. So I guess, Mr. Mayor, what I will say that as far as I can see, the terms of reference seem to be reasonably thorough. They seem to provide that opportunity for the public and others within the organisations to submit. But I guess I would just signal at this case, without prejudging anything, that there is a mood for change here, and that the kind of scenario that Mr. Hooton outlined of a few presentational tweaks isn't going to cut it this time round. So I commend you for the review, and I certainly look forward to what comes back in for us to consider.
Thank you, and Mr. Hooton has been wrong about a lot of things, and he'll be wrong again. Councillor Simpson.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. Look, CCOs, 75% of our business approximately, and 55% of our operational budget, and very little control. So I absolutely, even though the second word in the name of the organisations is control, I absolutely welcome this review and commend you for what you've done to get it to this point. I absolutely commend that we get on with it. I certainly wouldn't want to see it delayed. If there's one word I'm hearing, and we've all just been through an election period on the street, it's problems with our CCOs, and they make us look bad, and I believe, on many occasions. I want this to be a review that clearly uses people that have got good governance experience and understand how a model could work, and we have those people. I think we have those people out in the wider community. They haven't been identified, of course, but we've all been asked to feed through names. And the fact that it is independent and it is looking at both sides, I think adds further credibility. On top of that, we've got our CCO Oversight Committee, and I think that will also highlight an opportunity for us to do better in that space. We're all on that. And so collectively, I think we will sort of feed by default a little bit from the bottom up regularly in those meetings, I think, as well. But this independent review, I think, is welcomed by pretty much the majority of Aucklanders, and I say let's just get on and do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Walker.
So I just start off by commending you, Mr. Mayor, in allowing this review. So in my questions, I raised a number of things, and now I'll speak to them. So first off, I think it is going to be incredibly important for us to put some information out there that gives people a very clear idea now of how council and the CCOs function. For example, RFA is a charitable trust, we've got limited companies and the like. We've got a significant overlap on the part of some of the CCOs like RFA in terms of its delivery, with delivery across council departments. I think it's important that people have a clear idea of what the cost of the CCOs is, the cost of the boards and so on, because that will help to inform them. Because as Councillor Watson pointed out, there was a model that was imposed on us, and that does not mean that there are not other models that are satisfactory and could work. So in that respect, it's also important that we inform people about things like the Stafford report into the cultural review of RFA and its recommendations, because that fits. I'd suggest it's also important, as Councillor Watson mentioned, that there be an opportunity for people to give specific examples and case studies, because that will inform the reviewers. But given that this information is going to be public, it will also inform the wider public, because obviously they are going to have an interest in the review, and it will also inform us, and I think that's important. The other comment I'd make is that certainly from my engagement with CCOs, there's a lot of complication there, because they exist alongside us. There are issues around governments, there are issues around finance, there are legal issues and so on. So it's going to be really important to have some kind of templating, so that in respect of how people submit and engage, the task of the reviewers is made a little bit more easily. I'd certainly invite some response around that, but I think that's essential. I don't think we've had anything like this in any of the terms of this council thus far. So it's fresh territory and not something that many people will have engaged with. And lastly, it's going to be essential to have some kind of whistleblower facility, because there will be people within these organisations that want to make comment, and there will be people outside in the community that will want to make comment, but they may not want their names mentioned, because they may have business dealings with these CCOs. Bear in mind that there are huge numbers of companies in Auckland, and I mean huge, that engage with these CCOs because they are effectively amongst some of the biggest companies. Well, some of them are companies, but some of them aren't. Watercare is obviously a company in New Zealand. So those dealings need to be confidential because people could conceivably lose contracts, and some of those contracts are substantial.
Thank you very much, councillors, and can I commend councillors for not using their full time? It's not compulsory to go for 5 minutes. Councillor Newman.
Thank you. My apologies, Your Worship, I wasn't able to make yesterday's discussion. I too commend the review. I mean, my concern actually is I worry that the review could be a bit beige, that there needs to be real reform here, real change. The objectives are very, very diplomatically nuanced. I mean, I'll put my hand up and say that I would really question the appropriateness of, for example, RFA sitting out on its own as a standalone CCO, Pānuku, a T, by way of example. But hopefully this review will identify the appropriateness of those CCOs as standalone entities in the future, and what needs to emerge from that, if there isn't a need for those CCOs, is that legislation needs to be drafted by us, ready for the Minister of Local Government to take to Cabinet to give effect to that, because that will require a process, and Your Worship, you've identified the need for that process to be one which faces a lot of other legislative issues that need to be addressed by Cabinet and Parliament at the same time. I agree with D, and I want to thank Councillor Darby for raising it. In some respects, I agree with Councillor Hills and what he said in relation to the councillor's role here in the decision making, in the accountability relationship. The decisions that we have taken, the decisions that we actually haven't participated in or haven't commented on. The Pānuku adopts a reward philosophy and framework in 2017. $450,000 have been paid out. We made no comment about that in 2 letters of expectation subsequent. RFA goes through a negotiation with third parties around stadia reform, redevelopment of stadia that are not funded, which don't have the budget for funding, which would need to come back to the governing body. Yet the culture of RFA provides for that. We have the opportunity to have 2 elected members sitting on the board of Auckland Transport as deemed directors, but we haven't taken up that opportunity. So there is a need for D to be properly incorporated, and for us to assess our own function and our own accountability provisions, and to reflect back in a timely way how we give effect to the task of stewardship from a governance perspective. So I commend the D, which has been put up, but I would say that I worry about whether we're going to be sufficiently bold, and I worry about the timeliness of the reform that I think will be required subsequent.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And our CCOs are 10 years young. They're a creature of statute. We've been monitoring them at arm's length for those 10 years. And I think the point brought up by Councillor Newman is quite correct. Sometimes the arm's been too long. However, baby and bathwater comes to mind here. You know, we need to work with the CCOs through this process. This is not something we're going to do to them. We need to work it out with them and with this panel as well. It's a collaborative manner of working forward, using the external experts, using our own internal knowledge through the Oversight Committee, and the CCO's internal knowledge. There's an abject need for reform, but an object need to deliver a better outcome, and one that the public and the communities sign up to more readily. And part of that is our role. So, Mr. Mayor, this is a good start. It's going to be short and relatively sharp, and we need to deliver it with a complete focus on the community and best outcomes for the long term. And these sorts of reviews are healthy in the context and need to remain healthy in their delivery.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the short and sharp comment. Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm absolutely supportive of the review. I think a decade almost of Auckland Council is the right time to do this. I think it's all about bettering all sides of the relationship, and the main people it is for our communities. And I think they need to be able to understand and see more of what we all do, including the CCOs, and how this can help that relationship and promotion and communication back to the public. The other things I'm really supportive of is a move away from some of the corporate, maybe things like bonuses, things like conflicts of interest, things that maybe are assumed in the business world that shouldn't be assumed to be okay within a council or public framework. I know that being on appointment panels, I've really enjoyed that, selecting directors, but my focus has always been selecting people who are passionate and good on the subject matter or the CCO that we are selecting those people. I've not been interested in putting people forward who are just good directors, who have good experience in directors, because it's a public-facing entity and it should be about the people, not necessarily directors of businesses and things. But I will say that we have to be careful what we wish for, and I guess my concerns and the concerns of my community around CCOs are often caused by us or local boards or confusing situations. And I'll just give a couple quick examples. You know, obviously the unlock and transform areas in our community have been controversial, have been divisive, and Panuku has been laid the blame for Takapuna and the issues there. It's always Panuku, it's always Panuku. But the problem is that a local board asked for that work to be done. The last council unanimously asked for that work to be done. This council then asked for that work to be done. Panuku did more consultation than any other unlock or transform around the whole city. And then when the consultation was done, the public were in favour. But the rhetoric and the abuse by some elected members, like the absolute abuse of Panuku staff by some elected members, that if those elected members were employed people of this organisation, they would have had disciplinary action against them, was all aimed at Panuku. And in the end of the day, we asked, and every part of the organisation asked for those things to happen. Panuku was just following our democratic decisions, and then people didn't like that. Things around Auckland Transport, if we are making some of those decisions, that will be hard. I know that elected members around this table and previously and around local boards don't like necessarily making the hard decisions around car parks or bus lanes or cycle lanes or safety that Auckland Transport has to make based on evidence and based on the fact that we as a body unanimously support Vision Zero, unanimously supported the safer speeds, unanimously supported safety as a top priority for Auckland Transport. Then when they start implementing those decisions, we then find the easy way to stand on the front page of the paper with our arms crossed, bagging the actual implementation. So yes, it's not perfect. Yes, there are massive issues, and sometimes I get frustrated, and I have also bagged a situation where I have felt like I hadn't had the information or the decision making that I wanted. But most of the time, we have to look back on where that decision's come from and if it fits within. And those things happen with departments that a council run too, say parks or community facilities. That frustration happens, and we're in control of those decisions completely. So I think sometimes we have to look for solutions. Say the stadium debate, if that comes up again, we've heard a lot of opposition and confusion around that, but I'm still not hearing solutions on what to do in the future of, say, stadiums, say safety, say the city centre, when we don't like those things. So I think there's a lot of work the CCOs can do, but we have to be careful that we are not just using them as scapegoats, and we have to kind of grow up and make sure that we get exactly what we want, but we also back the CCOs when we've asked them to do something, and the public start turning on those decisions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I too want to commend you in calling for this review. I think it is timely, it is great, it is healthy work. I also just want to commend my colleague here to my right. I thought that was fantastic, and I agree with all those points. Quite apart from the legislative framework governing this that we're all well aware of, I mentioned in the past that the relationship with local boards should be specifically named in the terms of reference, and I hope that we can at least take the spirit of that forward when we're doing the review. And I did this because in many cases, particularly with Auckland Transport, but some other CCOs as well, the issues that communities have with CCOs have come through local boards and actually belong to that governance arm. In some cases, local residents have expected something to be done about their issues through the local board, who feel powerless because they see CCOs as unaccountable and not acting on something. So local board members can sometimes be caught in the middle between an angry public and a CCO that is not going to address the needs of that angry public. The other comment I have is that we are considering whether CCO or its function should be in fact separate rather than delivered in-house as part of this review. That can have huge financial implications for us, and I hope that this tight time frame actually gives us the chance to receive and consider sound financial advice on that. I also just want to address one last point. So I support Councillor Hills and his point here that CCOs adopting the trappings of corporate entities. That can be a concerning development, and I actually applaud the cultural aspect of this review here as well, that CCOs are seeing themselves as doing a public service in the public sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Darby.
So while I do support this, directive, I can't help but think that really looking at the CCOs without looking at the whole of the organisation, and I do acknowledge the words of Councillor Hills as well, is not going to deliver the result that we really should be expecting out of this work. I think without even with the D there, I think we're probably going to get some surprises out of this review that are going to shine the light right back on the core council, and we won't be immune from a really good solid criticism of ourselves, is my hunch. I mean, today we're hearing that a whole section of the legislation from 2009 in terms of the additional accountability provisions is not being exercised. The last quarterly CCO report, we had only half of the councillors here asking questions of the CCOs. And then we say they're out of control or they're beyond control, etc. But when we are required to turn up to exercise a level of control, there's not too many of us here. So I think all of that will be flushed out in this review as well. But for me, at the core of this is, and I think the public disquiet which we're representing here is symptomatic of a broader disquiet about the whole of the council. And that's very difficult as elected members who have just got over the line in a vote to think about reviewing the whole of the council. But let's keep in mind that 65% of registered voters did not vote in getting us over the line. 65%, it's a massive number of people who are not participating. And that goes right back to what the Royal Commission said, that created the legislation that allows us to be two systemic problems. One of the key systemic problems was the lack of public engagement. I think it stems back to that. That's my feeling, is that it stems back to this disenfranchisement. People don't feel like they have a place in the shaping of Auckland. And I think we've got much bigger work to do than just the CCO review. And one thing that I would probably like us to have a much bigger discussion about is looking on the 10th anniversary of the legislation from 2009, and then when it really, the new structures came into being in late 10, is looking at a review of the whole of the legislation and having a discussion with government about their buy-in to that. They should be very interested. That brought 7 cities into a big city. Now we're recognising that Auckland's a global city. It's going to be contributing disproportionately to the nation's GDP in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years hence. Government should be interested in the success of Auckland. I certainly am, and I know all my colleagues are really interested in the success of Auckland. But unless we go back and, with government, ask for a much bigger review, we will not know whether the structure that was delivered to us 10 years ago is the proper framework for governance in Auckland and the bright future of Auckland. So on that note, I probably want to leave this discussion in an area where we can explore further with the government a much fuller review of the legislation. The legislation at the time was suggested to be to be able to endure some 50 years. Well, when you're 20% of the way in, you really need to check where you're going. Do you have the right structure for Auckland? And for me, that is the big question. It is not just pointing the finger or suggesting that the problem is over there with the CCOs. I think it's a lot deeper than that.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mulholland.
Thank you, Your Worship. I commend and support the terms of reference and the review. I think it's appropriate and timely. My comment is for the officers and executive leadership team to be mindful of the communications to the public during this process. I feel that information sharing and continuing to communicate the process and where we're at is absolutely critical to helping our community understand. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Your Worship. Very quick points. I'm not going to go over what everybody said. I do, however, want to say that I don't envy the job the independent panel will have. One of the key things for me, listening to what's been said around this table, is that if people are going to forward reports, their views around what's happened with some of the CCOs, well then hopefully it's evidentially based and it's not them just mouthing off like some of them have when we've come to with deputations from the community. So one is about evidentially based. If you're going to do that to the panels, well then make sure you have the evidence around it. The other thing, Your Worship, is it's good listening to the councillors around the table agreeing to this review. I'm trying to figure out how we can put the cost that we all know that's in the report, in the recommendations, because no way do I want then people to go on social media around this table saying, no, look, I didn't think it was going to be this much and I don't support it as a result. So, look, Your Worship, I'm trying to sort of figure out how. I know it's been mentioned in the bulk of the report, you know, I mean, but we need to be realistic, and this is what the councillors have said around this table, and yourself. We need to be realistic in regards to it. We know that it's going to cost us and in turn the ratepayers money to do this review. So I want to I want to make sure that it's transparent to our community that, look, this is the cost that we're looking at. So, Your Worship, in closing, I just wanted to find out how we can actually put that, so then our community know that, yes, we've undertaken this review, and this is the estimated cost at least that we have. So, Your Worship, I, like everybody else, is applauding the fact that you've started this, but I just want to make sure that everybody around here knows the realities around how much it's going to cost. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, and I think I read the headline that said up to $800,000 in costs, so the media and the public have been advised of that. And interestingly, in ever since, I've received not one word of criticism that we're undertaking this review. So I think the public is on side, and I think that's important. Councillor Coombe is the last person I have on the list at the moment. That'll inject a few more names to come up. Councillor Coombe.
Kia ora, Mr Chair. Your Worship the Mayor. Thank you. I'd like to offer my support as well to this motion and getting behind the review. It's very timely. It is a huge job and I recognise that. Got to satisfy a lot of issues and I appreciate in terms of supporting this, I did just want to make a comment in going back to the whole purpose of the legislation that set up Auckland, and it was done in a way to corporatise Auckland and was set up very deliberately to remove decision makers and democracy from the model. And so we have struggled for a long time to make it work. And I think we have heard of lots of different examples, and I'm sure a lot of them are going to come through the review. And one I just wanted to highlight was that the whole structure was on the basis that politicians are not very good at making strategic decisions. But if you look at one example in terms of delivering on cycle lanes, which obviously is something I'm very passionate about, in Christchurch they're ahead of their program. Politicians have made those decisions directly, they've guided the strategy, they've done the delivery, and they have achieved far more than Auckland has. Unfortunately in Auckland we got the CCO got bogged down in its own politics and wasn't able to deliver on the promise of the model. So we didn't get the best of either world. We had politicians removed from the decision making, and I think we wouldn't have a program that's 3 years behind schedule if we had direct decision making right the way through. So I did just feel that I wanted to bring that to in terms of one of the reasons that we need to do this review, because I think we either have got to get the model working properly in the way that it was intended. And one provision that I always come back to that we have never utilised, and I know I'm coming from a local board perspective, but very clearly in the provisions it says that the governing body can direct CCOs, Auckland Transport, to act in accordance with local board plans. That provision has been there for 9 years and we have never ever utilised it. So we've given particularly Auckland Transport the ability to completely ignore our local board plans, which to me that's a big failing of the model. So I think this review will be really good in looking at what we can actually make work with what we've got, what needs to change, and also how we can separate out the perception from the reality and look also at how we can as a governing body operate far more effectively as well. And I tautoko the comments of Councillor Hills in that regard, and also Councillor Darby in terms of the bigger picture and what really needs to be looked at fundamentally. So I just wanted to add those comments to supporting the review, and thank you, Mr Mayor, for leading this work.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Sayers.
Thank you. I'll be voting in support of this recommendation. There's widespread concern with Aucklanders in terms of non-elected bodies making operational decisions, and a feeling of being marginalised, not being listened to, and are they really getting value for money? So, you know, CCOs are still public bodies, they're funded by Aucklanders, they should be accountable to Aucklanders. Maybe the structure isn't right, maybe the setup isn't perfect, but we need to present to Aucklanders some alternatives, something to think about to get better value for money across the Auckland Council group. So let's hope we deliver that. Hopefully, what I'd like to see at the end of the implementation of the recommendations will be a turn in the dial in the trust and confidence of Aucklanders in Auckland Council and her leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Good to see that everybody around the table is all singing from the same song, and we all realise it needs to be a review. One of the things that I'm just a little bit concerned about, with the interviewing of the panel, who is it around the council table? Is it the whole council that is going to interview those that are going to be on the panel, or is it just going to be a select one or two elected members? Can you give me that answer, please?
Yeah, look, I'll direct that one to our officers. My understanding is that we'd probably do it through APR, but just if you'd clarify that question, it's a fair question.
Through the chair, the process is in today's report. You're agreeing some criteria for the sorts of people that you collectively want to be on this independent panel. We've asked all of you to provide us with the names of people who you think would be appropriate panel members, and we're starting to gather some information about those people. There'll be a workshop on the 9th of December,
That's right, yeah,
where the governing body will discuss those names with final decisions to be made at the governing body by you all the week following.
Yeah, 12th of December is my recollection now, that the governing body will confirm that, but the names will be workshopped, and as Alistair has said, we have tried to collect as many names as possible, keep the pool as wide as possible, and make a decision within that. Our paper does talk about 3 members of the panel. I think, Claire, you might have mentioned 4, but we're pretty much keen on keeping the size of the panel down so it's a workable group, and it's keeping the cost of the panel down. But 3 gives you a range of different perspectives I think we need. Okay. Josephine Bartley, Councillor.
Thank you, Your Worship. I welcome the review. I commend you on not being all talk and taking some action on this and making sure that we're taking this seriously, because it is definitely something that communities have raised their concerns about in regards to CCOs. I appreciate Dee, and I recall the call from Lester Levy when he was Chair of Auckland Transport, asking us to take some leadership on what they're doing, which is fair enough, but I'm not keen to take leadership on something that I had nothing to do with or no input in. So I think that further highlights the importance of CCOs not working in silos, especially from elected representatives, and the need to remember that the projects that our CCOs are involved in are happening in communities, and that always needs to be given significance. And that also includes our local boards, because I just don't want to hear any more from people in my community and local boards that they feel that they're being done to. So if we get that right, then hopefully we can continue just keeping our focus on governance and not getting caught up in being advocates in regards to the implementation. So thank you for this, and yeah, fully support it.
Thank you very much. Well, it's been a fairly lengthy debate, so I think most things have been said. If I can just make a couple of points in summary, I think this is absolutely the right time to do an independent review. It's 10 years after the Super City was put in place, and we have focused specifically on the CCOs so that the review is a manageable review. If we were to do the whole council structure review, it would take 3 times as long and cost a whole lot more, and I think we'd lose the focus on the point that the electorate has been making to us very clearly, that they have a concern about the model around the CCOs. I think it's important that it's our review. Some people have said, well, you know, government should do a review of Auckland structure. The government imposed the structure we have on it. It's for us to do the review and for us to say how it's working for us, and I don't want to concede the power to government to do the review over our heads and say, well, we imposed this model and now we're going to impose that model. We will be the master of our destiny in this regard, but we will seek to work alongside government so government works in with us. I think it's important that we have had a couple of reviews already. It's not that nothing has happened with CCOs, but they've been in-house reviews. And I think the public expectation is that we have somebody from the outside, a panel of well-qualified people looking in so that they can place the criticism where they believe it belongs. So we won't be exempt from that process of criticism, and that is absolutely as it should be. I want to make the point that this is not simply a scapegoating or looking for a fall guy and saying the CCOs are the source of all evil. Some things they've done brilliantly. Some things they've done not well at all. And that is the balance of it. And what we're looking for is how the things that they haven't done well at all can be remediated. And that's what we want in these terms of reference. The terms of reference are wide. They talk about the model itself. They talk about accountability, and they talk about culture. And I just want to emphasise the point that a CCO is a public body. It's publicly funded by ratepayers and taxpayers. And I don't want to see the CCOs believing that somehow they are independent of public opinion or what we believe, or that they can adopt the trappings of corporate entities. And the alarm bell went off in my head when I found, unbeknown to probably anyone around this table, that there'd been a system of in-house bonuses instituted, and the former chief executive of Panuku, for example, was getting an $82,000 bonus for excellent performance. That came as a surprise to me, and I think it's unacceptable. I want to make sure that the culture of the CCOs is an understanding of their accountability to us. And I recall a very strong argument and strong words used when, in my early days as mayor, I received an email that wasn't intended for me, but with a CCO chief executive saying, it's our decision, we'll make the decision, and the elected representatives have go and mind their own business. This is our business, and we will be minding it. I want to say further that it's really important for the public to have an input into this. The public are intimately involved, and I concur with Councillor Walker and others that have said this should also be an educative process to determine that the public have a better understanding of what these bodies do and how they relate to us. I think it will be important to judge the effectiveness of the new initiatives that this council has now determined in its very earliest meeting to have an oversight committee of the CCOs and to have liaison councillors. I have strong hopes that both of those measures will improve the process that we are working through, and that is something too that the independent review will probably make a judgment on. I think there are important issues that we've got to decide. 55% of our operational expenditure spent through CCOs. Is it necessary that all of them be at arm's length from us, as the legislation seems to have intended, or should some of those be brought in-house? I don't make a judgment on that until I've seen the evidence and the independent review. But it could well be that some of those functions are better performed in-house, but let's see what the assessment of the evidence is by the panel. There is a question, I think Councillor Bartley raised it in her questions. Are CCOs commercial models or are they there for the public good? And the answer is probably a bit of both. We want them to operate effectively and efficiently, and sometimes commercially. But if they don't take into account the public good, why do we have them as public bodies? So it's finding those balances and whether we have the balance right in the current structure. The nature of the directors we put on, that is how we directly have an input into decision making, but are the criteria that we are following the right criteria? And I think those of us on the Appointment and Performance Review Committee have increasingly leaned towards saying we want them to have an understanding that while they have the skills of a director, that they are accountable back because they are part of a public body, and we want to make sure that that model is working well additionally. Then there's the other factor. When we set up, we had 8 different councils and we reduced it to 1, and then we set up 6 or was it 7 different CCOs, and the vertical silos that we had under the council organisation seem in some ways to have been replaced by horizontal silos, and that means that we haven't always got the efficiency and avoided the duplication that we could otherwise have done. we've made huge savings because we've started down that process of joint procurement and other things, joint insurance. And we want to make sure whether there are further things that we need to, and can do to make savings in that area. And that's an important part of what this review will be looking at. So I think the review is timely. I gather from the comments that have been made around the table and in other fora that we have operated that there is a strong support for this review taking place. And my expectation is that, unlike another review that I can think of relating to our ports, that this will be set up to be evidence-driven and that we will follow recommendations that are soundly based in evidence, and that may mean some significant changes, but I'm not preempting that. So thank you very much for all of the councillors who have participated in this and other fora. It's, I think, now timely that we move the resolution from A to D. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. That is passed unanimously. It may be appropriate for us to take just a quick break and then we'll move on to other items on the agenda. So a 5-minute break. Thank you very much, councillors, for your participation.